Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our public day event as a part of the HOMeAGE training series. And today's event will focus on impact and engagement for policy development. It is our fifth and final official public event, but we'll see what we can do in the next 12 months or so. So there might be some more. So for anybody watching online, do keep an eye out for that. So we have a really excellent program today, and I'm going to take very little time to introduce the program and leave the chairs and their individual sessions to introduce themselves. What I would say is that we're very much focused today, as soon as I can change. We're very much focused today on two things. One is about that engagement and policy impact, and I suppose the translation of some of the doctoral researchers' research program into kind of key policy and practice impacts, and how we can actually try and, if you like, elevate those research findings to have a greater impact. And the second is about a wider kind of scientific conversation around that scientific impact, and how do we try and generate that into making sure that science itself is more equipped to be inclusive and to be engaging with different contexts and different populations across the world. So on that basis, I'm going to hand us over to our first chair, who's Nora Keating. But what I would ask you online, particularly to keep in mind, is that we do have a website, and you will find all the different resources that are there. So I'll hand you over to Nora.
Thanks very much, Kieran. It's a privilege to be here and to have been part of this program since its onset. I'm a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee, which is a wonderful position to be in because you can make all kinds of suggestions, but you don't have to do all of that. So I'd recommend it to any of you, as you're building your careers. It's one to aspire to. I want to begin, though, by acknowledging two people who have been absolutely central to this whole program, to the way it's played out, to the inclusion of its members. I think it's so appropriate that we're talking about human rights here today. And those are Professor Kieran Walsh and Miss Christine Villardi, who together have made this all work and make it look seamless. You haven't seen the meltdowns after hours and behind the scenes, but there are stories they both could tell, including things like, how do you manage a program when you are, this was before this program, a cost action program in which I was involved, where we were here in Brussels when COVID descended. Our meeting was to have been at the European Commission. The doors closed the night before we were to meet. And by the next morning, voila, there we were with a new venue and everything happening. So thank you to both of you for making this all work. I'd also like to acknowledge the most fabulous group of early career scholars you will ever meet. Yesterday, I think many of you were with us in the European Parliament, where they gave the most beautifully crafted, elegant presentation on their work and kept those MEPs and DGs riveted on what you were saying. You're going to be great. You already are. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this, your development, your career development, and hearing about your research. Really, really nice work. The name HOMeAGE, I think I hear Kieran pronounce it as homage, which I think is a very clever name. I've never talked to her or Christine about the word, but it has those themes that we've been talking about throughout this program of home, of critical examination of the ideas that we all know and live across regions and settings. So in a way, it's a homage to those ideas, which are big ones and ones that we've been addressing throughout this program and will continue to do so today. Policy is central to the mission of HOMeAGE, which is grounded, I believe, in the assumption that the beliefs and actions of governments set the boundaries around what's possible, who's included, and how lives evolve. Of course, policy is adjacent to politics. and many of you come from places where principles of freedom, justice, and peace have been challenged. Perhaps you're here because of or despite of these challenges. I'm Canadian, and I'd especially like to acknowledge our speakers here today from the United States, our closest neighbor, where bonds of friendship and collegiality have become even more important. Under the HOMeAGE banner, we as researchers and policy analysts connect beyond politics with a common belief in social justice. So I think it's fitting that we begin today with the United Nations, which has long set what I see as the moral imperatives for our times. You will know, I expect many of you will know, that in 1948 was the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Read its preamble sometime. It begins with this statement: whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And here we are, and our speaker will pick up on that narrative and tell us how we're doing. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Dr. Claudia Mahler, who is an academic who has become the second UN independent expert on the human rights of older persons. She's had this role, I think, since 2020.
Yeah.
Right, starting with COVID, which is a great way to begin anything. And I was going to, in my opening remarks, talk to you about her mandate. She is rather better positioned to do that than I am. So I will leave that to her to talk about in her beginning remarks. Let me just say that we're delighted to have you here. I'm going to turn the floor over to you and ask you to speak to the UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. Claudia.
Thank you so much, Nora. You're welcome. Thanks a lot. So thank you for the warm welcome. And as you already heard, I'm the United Nations Independent Expert on Enjoyment of All Human Rights for Older Persons. Long title, in short, Human Rights, Older People. So that's enough to know, because what we also realize is that the UN does not really have anybody else dedicated to this, but I will also go with you through the last decade and enlighten you a little bit. What does it mean to be a UN independent expert? You also see on my slides that I'm working at the German Institute for Human Rights, which is my day job. So it is my pleasure also to serve at the United Nations as independent expert for the special procedures. You might not be that familiar with the whole UN system, but you might know that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is based in Geneva, which is one of the branches which really focuses on human rights. And the special procedures are one unit there. I'm part of special procedures. I'm the only entity there. I have a wonderful secretariat, which is based in Geneva. Myself, I'm based in Berlin. I also managed, fortunately, to get assistance in Berlin to really focus on the work. So as you already said, I started my work during the COVID pandemic crisis, however you want to name it, in 2020. And you can imagine I was looking forward to go to the countries, to have speeches, to learn a lot on the national level. Unfortunately, there was no travel in the first year, nothing at all. I should also say my mandate entitles me to 2 country missions per year. What is a country mission? It's an official mission to one country around the world. I get invited by the government. I have 12 to 14 days in the country where I manage to have conversations with the government, with civil society, with all the people themselves, and then reflect on all what I heard and give recommendations on the last day already, preliminary recommendations. And I write, sorry, too much coffee in the morning. And I write a full-fledged report which is launched then in the Human Rights Council. And so I too, on a regular basis, have 2 of them per year. Unfortunately, now, because of the liquidity crisis, I only have 1 per year, which I can say is really heartbreaking, but it might also be the problem of the next independent expert, because I will finish my term in the end of April. But I'm also quite happy that my dedicated reports, which I'm also entitled to deliver, which are thematic reports, and I can write 2 per year, 1 to the Human Rights Council and 1 to the General Assembly, had a huge impact on the discussion. And we even got 2 substantive resolutions in Geneva out of it. You might think, okay, a substantive resolution doesn't sound very enlightening, but in the end, it is agreed language which can be used for a drafting of a convention. So I was really happy. Now I take the water. So I was really happy that my report on ageism and age discrimination was set up in a resolution, and my report on violence against older people was set up in a substantive resolution. So we already have agreed language on both issues, which is quite good, because ageism is a term which still is not part of the UN system, except we do have the wonderful report which WHO, the Office of the High Commissioner, and DESA wrote together, the global report on ageism, but it's still not part of the language of the human rights system. So it was really good that we could introduce it with this resolution. So having said all this, my thematic reports also have recommendations. And these recommendations are sometimes taken up by civil society organizations or researchers. They work with it. And this then comes to lived realities on the national level if they are translated into policy. So you see, my work is on the one hand academic, but very practical. And before I do write a report, I always ask for contributions. And I don't know how much you're familiar. There are regularly calls from special procedures for contributions. So you might find also other calls, not only from my mandate. For example, there is now a call out from the mandate on violence against women, on older women. So if you have something to contribute, it would be wonderful if your research can feed into these reports, because then they go either to the GA or to the Human Rights Council. So I think now you have a little bit of an idea what an independent expert is doing. Besides my thematic reports and my country reports, I give a lot of talks, and I'm very often invited at the United Nations to speak up for older persons, because they are regularly overlooked. So you cannot imagine how much time it took. Okay. No. Whatever. We can also do it without a presentation. Doesn't matter. So I was saying that I just on the way here, I told Tina that it took me ages to get older women into the Commission of the Status of Women in New York. One would believe that's a no-brainer. Why would, oh, perfect, thank you. So why would older women not be included in this discussion on women issues? You know, on a regular basis, everybody promotes life course approach, but then you look into policies, you look into measures, you look into development cooperation programs, you check the budget, older women are not there. So how can we facilitate something useful for older women if they're totally missing? But I'm now here also to focus on the new developments. I guess you are familiar that we did have discussions, ongoing discussions in New York for more than a decade on the rights of older people to strengthen them. And I know that a couple of people have been there too. So we have one meeting each year. And it is really essential to once again see, all the people are included in the Human Rights Universal Declaration already, but it seems to be too broad. We don't see them in the regular discussions. So what we also saw is that, for example, the Convention on the Rights of Children had a much bigger impact because it was dedicated to the specific topic. It was really shaped for the needs. Same for people with disabilities. This is why we came up with the UN more or less came up with the idea to discuss how we can strengthen the human rights of all the people. One branch is to better implement what we already have. Good call. But did something really happen in the last 10, 15 years? Honestly, not much. So I always ask the politicians, you're always telling me the better implementation would do the trick with what we already have. But where are the positive examples? Share them with us. Give them to us. What have you really done? What is the better implementation? What does it look like? And regularly, I don't get an answer. So what we see is that this is a kind of a defense. But I really think that sometimes also the current human rights framework is not fit for purpose because it's not specific enough. What do you do with an article which says the highest attainable standard of health? How do you trickle this down to long-term care and all the real principles we need to include here? And I think this is really where older people also come into the loop. This is a picture when I have been, unfortunately, it's not good enough anymore. This is a picture where I have been to Moldova and visited all the people on the countryside. And I really asked them, what do you need? And they said, we need a place to meet. We need somebody who gives us the information, what support is really available. And we would love to get some social workers to support us in all our daily causes, because this is not taken part of. You have it in the policy, but there is nothing really sufficient on the national level. So these are the examples I also like to bring to the international discussions to show them, yes, we do have a couple of policies, but they are not specific enough and they are not working in practice because they don't have enough budget or there are not enough people to really do the work. So the current situation is that we have a global framework. We have two covenants from the 60s, which have been in force since the 70s. We have the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which does not really help us for older people. We do have the Convention on Women. We also do have a Convention on People with Disabilities. There are intersections, for sure. A lot of older people do have disabilities, so this applies. But if we look on the national level, we see that a lot of laws make a distinction between older people and people with disabilities. Very often we see that the social support is totally different if you're an older person or if you're a person with a disability. Or we find age limits, and then you don't get the full support anymore. So we already see that in the structure of the national level, there are very often age limits or ageist approaches in the structure, and nobody's really aware of them. So I think we need to untangle this once again and have the conversation once again. Why is this structure like it is? Why do you apply negative stereotypes that all older people are dependent, need support, don't know exactly their will and preferences, and you can overrule them? No, that's not what we want. We want to see older people, and I always ask myself, how do I want to live in old age? And I think this is also very often one of the good things. If you ask the policymakers, how do you want to live on your own? in your old age. Nobody tells you he wants to live dependent with support and without having something to say when he wants to get his meal or when he wants to go to sleep. So I think the reality check makes it quite visible what it also means to be a vivid part of the society. A lot of older people want to be active. A lot of older people are active, and they are very contributing. They're contributing a lot, either through volunteering or still in teams. But this is not seen, especially the contribution of older women are invisible. And I think this is also why we need to work on the issue. We also want to have more evidence to those ideas and to bring, for example, the data on the contribution of older people. I sometimes get as a defense, older people cost us so much. But my answer very often is, but I think the inaction also costs us more. And this is an example when we think about prevention. We very often hear that the prevention is the first thing where the budget cuts are taken on. And then we also see that the budget for healthcare support is rising. So sometimes it might be much better to start earlier in regard of prevention to save money on the other end. But this is quite hard for a politician who only thinks in a 4-year or 5-year term. So these are long-standing ideas. And therefore, I also think we also need to have research, which is also a kind of budget related, to ensure that the politicians also understand that this is a good cause also in regard of an economic idea. I hated these economic ideas in the beginning because I always said, it must be good enough to be a rights holders. But now I also understand after 6 plus 10 years how the policymakers are thinking. And I think it's good for all of us to understand that budget and economic relations are key for them to ensure that their policies are supporting their own cause. But what we also realized during the last decade is that because the UN did not move forward, we managed to get a couple of regional instruments. For example, the Inter-American system came up with a full-fledged Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, which is a very good example where a good starting point. It's not perfect, but it's a good starting point. We can hopefully come up with a better definition, but we will see. We also got an additional protocol on the African Union on the rights of older people, which is also a very good cause for them. And it also shows that this is not something just the northern countries or the industrial countries are thinking about. This shows us that the South, the global South, is really interested in the topic because they want to get prepared now. So I think it's also a question of solidarity, how best we support them. And one of the instruments which supports them quite well is a legally binding instrument of the UN, because it sets the normative minimal standards. We don't want to see that member states use this to increase the current standards we're already having. This is just really to set the minimum standards. And I think this is another issue where we also have to have this conversation with member states to once again ensure do no harm, which means don't use this instrument to lower your national standards. And I also should, because we are now here in Brussels, bring back also the European framework. We do have the Charter on Social Rights, which has a dedicated article on the elderly. We do have mentioned older people in the acquis of the European Union a couple of times. And we do have a non-binding recommendation of the Council of Europe's Ministerial Declaration from 2014, which has a quite good definition. And it was really a pleasure also to working on this instrument, but it also showed me during these, I think it was 6-7 years, that member states apply different standards when it comes to older people. Even though we already had the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, they were really reluctant to apply the same standards in regard of autonomy, independent living for older people. And this is something we really always need to keep in mind when we want to support member states in drafting a new convention. We only get this one chance, and we should not leave it to those who really want to get only minimal standards. So I think this is also where I see, I already talked about this. This is also where I see that research has a lot to say and to give, because it's much easier for policymakers to ensure that they have standards which apply to lived realities, which are evidence-based. Therefore, I see you all have a big role here. So I spoke about the decades we had before. I also introduced my mandate. The working group, the open-ended working group on aging, closed in 2024. And the resolution which closed the working group said, every other UN entity can take up the topic. And we were quite happy, and we got this milestone resolution in March 2025, which really starts the drafting of a UN convention, which is not named UN Convention, it's named a legally binding instrument for the rights of older people. And we are now at a very different stage. The decades before, we were talking mainly, very often, do we want the convention or not? This is gone. Now we are talking, which content do we want to see in this legally binding instrument? And this is key. First of all, we do have the first constitutional session in February. This will shape the whole process. The whole process must include all the people, academics, national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, but member states are in the driving seat. But we also need to ensure that everybody else has a seat on the table, either to be part of the national delegation or on their own. It's much easier to get a seat on the table in Geneva than in New York, because civil society is included in Geneva all the time. And this open-ended working group is even open for civil society organizations without ECOSOC status. So you can subscribe for the whole process on Indico, also with other status, if you're not an ECOSOC accredited civil society organization. And this also gives a lot of academia access to the whole process. But having said that, the main work will be done on the national level, because till now we still have to move forward to give national governments support ideas how to shape the process. They are not quite there. This is also a chance to ensure that we get civil society and academia and your outcomes into these discussions. It might also be a chance for all of us to raise the issue once again on the national, regional, and international level. We discussed it also this morning. It's quite hard to get funding for this kind of research and for the topic at large, but it might also shape this decision-making because it's now an international set agenda. This is just the first article of the resolution. And I think it really shows what we want to achieve and that all the persons need to be included. The mandate itself is also included in the resolution, so we'll always have a seat on the table. So, as I said before, we also need to shape the whole process. So what are the overall principles we want to see? Equality and non-discrimination. We also want to ensure that the intersection in regard of discrimination is at the table, multiple discrimination and intersecting discrimination, which are not very well tackled in the current human rights framework. We also, as I said, need to ensure that all the people do have a meaningful participation to ensure a reality check if the articles really have an impact on the national level, on their lived realities. And also see how this international legal framework might resonate on the national level. So if you already have kind of good examples, what works well on the national level, this can be brought to the international level as a good example. Whatever it is in regard of, you're entitled to long-term care, to stay in the community, to get support. There are many things which can be relevant, or also what new ideas are there already on the table to ensure the inclusion of all the people in regard of digitalization, which will be a new topic. Because as I told you, the conventions of the 60s are not tackling this issue, as we are all aware. Another aspect which is not tackled in the current human rights framework is the impact of the change of our environment. Everything which has to deal with floods, heat waves. How do we ensure that governments take preventive action and support everything which is, which is also in the lead of this? Another aspect which I always tackle quite oftenly is all the people in crisis, emergency settings, or on conflicts. Unfortunately, we realized through the Ukraine war that many older people don't get the information in a way which is understandable for them, because most of the information came through social media. So they did not know when they had to go down, if it was possible anymore. A lot of them lived also in big buildings with elevators, but without power, there is no chance to use it. So they were trapped in the buildings. A lot of them in the rural areas were cut from their support in regard of medical support, but also in regard of getting food. Or another example, my Canadian colleagues always bring to me, if there's a lot of snow and ice, nobody really supports them. And it's the same in Sweden. We very often see that, or in the Nordic countries, a lot of older people are trapped when there's a huge winter storm, for example, because they don't get the support, especially in the countryside. And this also brings me to one of the topics which I tackle very often with governments: urbanization. If we see the numbers, many of the people are left behind in the rural areas because the younger ones move to towns, cities, to urban centers to find work, which also has huge impact on the infrastructure in the rural areas, not only in regard of healthcare, in regard of very basic issues. So I think this is also one thing we can tackle with a kind of human rights-based convention to ensure that nobody is really left behind, which is one of the big discussions we always have in our modern world. So these are the next steps I already told you about. there is this constitutional meeting on the 18th to the 20th of February in Geneva. And as far as I've seen in the calendar, there are 2 meetings for this year, one in July and one in October. We are not sure, because of the current situation, that they will be a full week. It might be that they are short of 3.5 days or 2.5 days, but I still hope that we get 4 days. The budget was mainly approved in December. There should be a unit working on the whole thing as a secretariat now. I heard that they can hire now 2 more people, but the whole secretariat will only be 3 people then, which is quite a low number. So this might also be a point where researchers or research groups really can support the secretariat with a couple of issues, because on a regular basis, they do write background papers before we have a session. So it might also be a chance to cooperate with the secretariat. I don't know if they are willing to, but I'm just seeing this as a kind of chance to also go in the right direction. And as I said before, what we also need is good coordination. What might not be useful is too many ideas on the table without a coordination and with an agreed language. So I think this is also a task where I see that these networks have to cooperate or join forces a little bit more. I know there are a couple of research groups in the US, in Europe as well. I don't know how much you are linked to each other. That's something I don't know, but it might be useful to also get in contact with civil society organizations, because they want to have a caucus, which will be the preparatory part for the whole drafting process. And it might be good also to get a kind of a caucus or a group who's in the end also bringing the voices of research to the table. I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer all the questions. I know it was fast. These are maybe 20 years in a nutshell, and I'm happy to answer everything what you want to hear. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claudia. I expect there will be many questions, and I wonder, I'll let you take one more sip of water, but I've got one that I think this group might be able to help you with.
Sure.
You've in a sense presented a challenge to us to provide input to the process, but not provide 10,000 ideas that you all would like to have. So thinking about yesterday's presentation at the European Parliament and how succinct and policy relevant that work was, I just wonder if, maybe I should turn to the audience first, shall I? If in this audience, either here or online, you think about what from the HOMeAGE project program would be some key ideas. Claudia's already given us an opening around things like rural regions, around issues of climate change, of things going on in particular spaces. But what could you contribute to this agenda? Because it seems like this is the time. So who would like to leap in and have their first great idea? I think I've stopped them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for oil work.
Yes. Yeah, we manage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Czech Republic. I want to thank you for all your work for all these years. It was great. And I'm just standing witness of how you work with research, because one of my research projects, The results are submitted to one of your inputs, and it did indeed made it into the report.
Yes,
It's worth doing. Yes, it works, guys, do it. And I'm really excited because I really saw that it makes impact, and thank you so much. It was also made into part of the definition of elder abuse. And if I may, just before we get to your question, thank you very much. You added one intriguing point to the definition on hate speech, which is I hardly seen before and not really debated enough. So if you can develop it a little bit on, because I see that especially in my country, but I see that we debated also with our colleagues, now the kind of new waves of debates on demographic time bombs and fusions and all these things. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for the contribution and also to reading the report afterwards, because I guess not everybody has the time to read them. And yes, I think we had a lot of discussion. Does it work? Okay, I just speak up.
Only they connected.
Whatever you tell me. Okay, now it works?
No.
It's it.
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I try this way.
Sorry.
No, we will manage, you know. I had a lot of discussions also in regard, because there is already this definition from WHO, and I saw that during the time, especially during COVID time, language was really badly used, and it had a lot of negative impact on the lives of all the people. And they also, this was one thing you said in the beginning, they might not want to speak up, you know. So that's why I included this, and I see that it's really needed. But what we don't have is we don't have a real entity who follows this advice to deal with it. So it's there. I think still it's a good idea. It should be included, but I don't see a lot of measures taking this on board. But thank you so much for mentioning it.
Other idea.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very enlightening. So the question that I have is more about after having a convention. In some countries, for example, when a convention of women's rights was introduced and ratified by many countries, some of the countries ratified it like completely conditionally. So what happens is that, for example, what I have seen, conventional support of child rights or women's rights, it happens many times that it gives like this kind of checkbox for many countries who don't have that strong democratic backbone to support people. So they have this checkbox in the UN that they are ratifying the convention and they are supporting. What happens in reality is really different. So many women or children, they don't have that right. And in reality, they are really suffering. So is there any kind of way that this scenario doesn't happen for women, right?
So I think part of the question too is there more than a moral imperative to signing on to this question?
What I see also in a lot of countries is that implementation goes in line with measures. So we also need to have this kind of monitoring on the national, regional, and international level. But if the monitoring is also part of civil society organizations, and I know what you're speaking about, we do have a lot of still member states who don't have a huge part of influential civil society organizations. So it might be hard to really focus on the implementation. But if it's taken on board and taken seriously, you can work with it and you can really use it. But that's with all the laws on national level as well. Laws might be nice on paper, but the implementation might be very weak and the outcome might be not sufficient. So I think we always have the same problem, but we still have to see that the law and the convention itself is good in itself and is consistent. We are not at the level where we know about the implementation. I told you, that a lot of member states still argue that those conventions of the 60s are sufficient because they are including older people. Yes, they are not excluded, but it's not specific enough. So it's quite hard to point the finger, you have not implemented this in the way we want to see it, because there's almost nothing how the way we want to see it would look like. So this new convention, and I think especially in regard of the rights of the child, which is quite elaborated also for people with disabilities, you have a lot better idea what it means to implement them. Still, member states need to implement it in a way that it's meaningful. And I also know that a lot of people are suffering even though they are entitled to their rights. But on the other hand, if you're an older person and you still feel you're not a rights holder, you will never stand up and ask for your rights. So I think it's not only a moral implication, it is also a tool which you can work with. And it might shape really the difference, or it really has a huge impact on the national level if older people are not seen as only beneficiaries. Because if you're seen as a rights holder, you might claim that you're entitled for a pension. You might claim that you're entitled for long-term care. But if you have the feeling you're a beneficiary and this is benevolent work of the government, you will never stand up for your rights because you don't have the feeling that this is a right for you. So I think, yes, it is weak, but it has an impact. But it's also that human rights are only as strong as we fight for them. I think we also took it for granted for the last 30 years that we, on the one hand, live in peace, have democracy, and have our human rights. So we are also now at a very different level that we realize our human rights are under threat. And this is also because we have all this discussion on migration. If you stripe one group of their rights, it is quite easy to take the next one. So I think it is still valid and useful to raise our voices that we want our rights and we want them to be implemented in a meaningful way.
Well, and I think your argument is perhaps even more so now.
Yeah.
Frank.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this impressive talk. I have a question with respect to the aspect that you said the convention is legally binding. And as we have learned in the last years from the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, particularly then in our domain, so to say, with respect to people living with dementia, the legally binding aspect is something that is kind of great to have, but not easy to transmit into, everyday life, let's say in a care home or even when it comes to informed consent procedures, something like that. So could you explain a little bit about what this would mean if we would have a convention on the rights of older people, the legally binding aspect? I think this might be I would be very much interested in that. Thank you.
It should be like this. Good. It's green. It should work. So the legally binding instrument, the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities is a legally binding instrument, but as you already mentioned, it's always only as good as it's implemented and translated into national law and action. But what does national law and action mean? It also means budget and quite clear standards, especially when we talk about people with dementia. Very often it's not quite clear. Do they really fall under the group of people with disabilities, or are those older people who do have disabilities and therefore are not tackled in this regard? Because we always see that there are, slight gray areas. So with a convention of the rights of older people, we can manage to get rid of this gray area, to ensure that older people with dementia do get the same rights in regard of autonomy, decision-making, and independent living. These are the areas where I already said we had trouble in Europe already, that these have, they try to introduce the rights in a different way. So I think, from my perspective, if we do have a legally binding instrument, this gives us a very good working tool to ask the government once again and reiterate the call to better implement this, because this is a right to do it. So this is the legally binding thing if the member state ratifies it. But we also have to say, sometimes it's also good enough to have national legislation. For example, US never ratified any of the conventions, but they had a very good law in regard of people with disabilities. Unfortunately, I don't know at which stage we are now, but the law was quite good. But, I also know that there were high expectations on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And I had an exchange with the State Secretary on this topic, because he said, it also brought a lot of disappointment because we did not manage to implement it in a way that people thought it would be implemented. And I think this is also something where we need to be fair, that there might be a first stage, and then we can develop it and increase the support and make it happen over the years. But it's not good enough that we just see it and say, okay, this does not work here. We really need to insist with the politicians once again and change the law in a meaningful way, and also ensure that the budget is allocated to these specific measures. Otherwise, it will not work.
I'm Laura Christ, and I'm a member of. I'm Laura Christ. I'm a member of All the Women's Network in the Netherlands, also All the Women's Network Europe, and both organizations are a member of HOMeAGE Platform Europe, and it is largely through HOMeAGE Platform Europe that we've been able to work on all these issues that of all the women for their support. Even so, I must say, especially in the Netherlands, we're now 5 women holding up this very small organization and bringing up the same issues year after year, getting nowhere. And not even the Dutch Women's Council covers all women's organizations.
I know.
Over 1 million. So, you can't get them interested in issues for women. Generally, yes. We can't get through. But I think we're at the point almost of giving up. But
No, never give up.
I think we're talking. We can try to be very strategic. We can find ways to put it on the agenda and in Europe. There must be ways. It's not a matter of growing our network, but to find the right strategy. And you gave me a lot of input. And I used to be in the 1990s the director of an institute combating age discrimination. It was new. It has disappeared over the years. But there was the state secretary of the Department of Health and Welfare in the Netherlands. Very much supported our.
Long ago, unfortunately.
That he was called, and she always said, "Frappez toujours." So, and you're saying the same. So, thank you very much, Eva.
Thank you so much. And when you're talking about this women network maybe you can also just go back to your ministry right now and ask them who will attend the roundtable on older women at CSW in March to raise awareness once again. And if they have an older women also on the delegation, because this is key, because it's one of the 3 topics this year. So maybe this is also one thing, once again, where you can raise awareness, you know, knocking on the door. Giving up is never an option.
Hello, Dr. Mahler. I am a doctoral researcher here at Harvard. I am particularly thrilled to have you here because my research is about a human rights-based approach to aging place.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm happy to say that my colleague Rita Joseph and I also wrote a contribution for older persons in context of armed violence. We wrote about older Palestinians, and happy to also know that we made this point and it's in the report. But I wanted to refer to something that I'm doing recently, also inspired by the war. I was recently in the Dominican Republic. You've been there, you wrote a report. And you've been there with the commander, with the other person's council.
Yeah.
And I did a very small study recently with other persons there. And I asked them about the potential impact of convention, their lived realities. And while they were happy to know that there was some progress in the fight for rights, they were concerned that nothing really would change in the short run of their lives. Because still already have a national law and not much changes. They were particularly saying that there are also no consequences.
Yeah.
So we want to know what could be the reflection then for a legally binding, legally binding for national governments also.
Thank you also to, give me some ideas going back to my, country mission. It was quite inspiring also to see what was done. But one of my recommendations also in regard of CONAPE was that the monitoring would have some, impact. And this was not taken up, unfortunately. And what I see is that there also needs to be some willingness to ensure that the legal framework, which is already there, also gets some impact. And I don't know if you recall, but I also had a couple of recommendations in the cooperation together with the UN in the Dominican Republic, because I also saw that, for example, their cooperation did not really work out in the highest standards we want to see in regard of care homes, for example. So I still think, it would be good to maybe knock on the door of the UN regional office there, because they were very supportive in the days, and ask them to have a round table once again to see how they implement the recommendations of the report, which would be a follow-up and an official follow-up, which might help in the end. Unfortunately, and this is something I'm very unhappy about, is there is no follow-up process from the reports. But I can tell you that, for example, I had a country mission to Finland, and the civil society organizations and the National Human Rights Institution took up the follow-up of the recommendations, and it really had some impact. So maybe this is one thing where you can take the report and maybe just get 2 or 3 recommendations and work with the UN-based agencies in the Dominican Republic and try to get this going. I can try to speak with the mission in Geneva again. They are always very helpful and very supportive and raise this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. A question just while we're waiting for the next question to come in. And so, Claudia, you mentioned that idea of setting minimum standards, and it's supposed to be a critical exercise for standards. Outside of that, how much do you think we still have to raise our own ambitions for later life to I suppose, address some of the systemic ageism, but also internalized ageism and what we expect from how that might feed into setting and raising the standards.
I think, first of all, every discussion on ageism is useful because still a lot of people are not aware. And you always hear it, in the comments. You sometimes see it, but very often you hear it. And I think if we got one lesson from COVID, it was that all the societies are ageist in the end. So we saw that the life of older people was not valued in the same way as the life of younger people. And therefore, I still think every discussion on ageism, where you also, think, feel, and, get to this notion where you see, oh, I still myself, I'm ageist, I'm not as fit as before, but this has nothing to do because I'm not doing my work right. My answer is because I'm aging, On the other hand, why would I be fit? I'm traveling all the time. So, I can't be fit. So these are just a couple of issues. Or if somebody makes a nice or thinks he makes you a compliment, oh, you really look good for your age. Either I look good or I don't. So, and you also said it in the beginning, we do have all these notions about the boomers, for example, right now, which are very negative in the discussions. But we also have to tackle this from a structural way. And I think those kind of age limits I mentioned in the beginning, if there are, for example, some social support structures which do have age limits, why do they have these age limits? Those people, if there's age limit is around 60, might live 30 more years. What does this tell us? And I think we still need to tackle the whole idea once again. Our current system of going to school, working, and retiring is not valid anymore. I think we really need to tackle this also. Most of the people want to take a break, go back to education, and restart again. And this might also give us a much better potential in later life if we also get the chance to restart again. I think one of the data I really like to bring all the time is that older entrepreneurs are the most successful, but we never hear about them. We only hear about the posh startups. But the older entrepreneurs are the most successful and sustainable ones. So I think this also gives us some kind of feeling, why do we still have these negative stereotypes and not embrace the positive part of longevity? What do we really need to overcome this? And on a private basis, on a regular basis, if you ask, how fit are your grandparents? Most of them are really fit. They don't fit anymore into what we have seen 20 years ago. So I think we also need to rethink our current understanding what aging means and longevity. I'm not sure if I really answered your question, but I think it goes in the direction that we need to start the discussion again. Because everybody say, yeah, okay, ageism, what really does it mean? Negative stereotypes? Sure, yes, I do have a couple of negative stereotypes, but they don't understand how embedded this really is in our thinking, in our structure, in our policy, in our whole living together.
No, you have answered it, Claudia. I think the other piece then is that rather than understanding, I think that independence and autonomy, it's just even interesting to hear you talk about in the context of disability, because when you move to aging, again, it's kind of more of a ceiling on those kind of concepts, more of a narrow idea of what that is, and I think actually means for people who are suffering with chronic kidney health or whatever it may be, to understand the full notion of autonomy.
Maybe one small example which makes it quite clear. If you're, I see this now also in my private life, older people who are really healthy, who manage their whole life on their own, but they have problems with their stairs to go up to their flat and go down again. So at one point, they will need to move out because there is no elevator available. So what does this mean for us, you know? And all the politicians are talking about that we need to have accessible housing. With this kind of accessibility, autonomy and independent living would be much longer available. But because of these small things, you know, like having only staircases and no elevator, or no chance to change flats, because the smaller flats which are available and accessible are much more expensive than those where they are living in. So those kind of, you know, policies in regard of housing have such a negative impact on the lives of all the people. Or, as I said before, the infrastructure in the rural areas. If you're not having a doctor or a supermarket in walking distance, what does this mean for an older person at a certain age? They either need to have infrastructure which really supports them. Okay, one could say, yeah, but we can get everything on Amazon. Yes, but not everybody is digital native and use this kind of stuff. But if there are no buses available or no drivers available who supports you in doing your groceries or go to the doctor, this really means you need to find another place. Another aspect is, for example, a lot of indigenous older people. They need to go to a care home in some area which might be hundreds of kilometers away from their family because nothing is available. So I think the infrastructure itself to make autonomous and independent living a lived reality is far away, and it's not that costly, but it's far away because it's not ingrained in our policy thinking and policy making.
Thank you so much for all of your work and your presentation as well. I wanted to ask, a lot of the work we do in our network deals with the well-being of older adults beyond health or disability. So in terms of their sense of belonging to their environment, as you said, the ability or opportunity to reach local information about support, about engagement, not just health or social care. And I wanted to, but we also increasingly see that within policy context, but also when we write our academic papers, for example, we have to kind of link these more abstract concepts to health outcomes again. And that's where the economic value comes in as well. And I was wondering how maybe convention might help bring more value or economic value to these so-called abstract concepts that are equally important to adult well-being.
I think it might help, but we will see, you know, it's quite hard to speak in these abstract ways because we don't know how the convention really looks like. But it's a good thinking from the beginning to ensure that the articles support especially those social developments as well, including the positive effects for society. I think this is really very well thought, but I know that nowadays you have to link everything with health because this is where the budget goes and where they also see that you have data on it. You don't have any data on the other aspects. And I think this is also something maybe your work can improve. I'm a lawyer, sorry. I'm not 100% sure how you can do this kind of research and get the data to it. But it might be helpful, you know, to bring it to the notions. I very often also hear from all the people around the world, they just want to have a place where they can meet and maybe cook together and have some time to exchange with their own constituency and maybe also mingle with the younger generation. But they also see the space is very limited. it's either there is too much violence, or there is no space left anymore, or they have to pay for coffee or whatever. There are no spaces available where they just can meet. So this was one of the positive outcomes in Peru. They found a house where they can meet. They are cooking together, so they spend less money on the whole thing, and all they ask for is to get the fence to support the property, because it was demolished a couple of times. So you see, sometimes there are very small things which bring a high value to their life. And I think that's a very valid idea, yeah.
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative here and ask a final question, if I may, that I hope will give us some practical ideas about some of these principles. Having worked myself in that interface between research and policy much of my life, one of the things that my colleagues and I often say is evidence is a poor intervention. So let me ask you, in a practical way, you talked, at least in general in your presentation, about some of the topics that are likely to be part of the convention. To what extent are those available? To what extent can we see those at this stage? Because I'm thinking about how a researcher might be invited in a way that's practical and targeted, and can take some of the evidence that they've created that really might inform some of those topics.
Yeah. Thank you for this very practical question. I think it's, on the one hand, it's an easy one, because we already have the Inter-American Convention on the Rights of All the People. This gives us a very good model how it can look like. But I'm sure we need to improve a couple of things and maybe reshape it. But it is, on the first hand, a very good model, how it can look like. It has overarching principles, it has a preamble, and then it goes into the definition, what an older person is, and then it goes down to, what the content should look like, which is all the different aspects we have been talking about, like housing, health, long-term care, all you can think about, decision-making process, autonomy. These are all aspects we need to tackle in. There is also the Ministerial Declaration of the Council of Europe from 2014, which I think gives you a good idea of how a definition could look like, because the definition of the Inter-American Convention is a little bit poor. It's quite good in regard for governments, because it makes it easy with an age limit, but for the overall idea, it's not a good decision to have an age limit, because it really does not bring the differences of all the aspects, what old age means, to the table. Just one example, if you're talking about work, you are an older worker already in your 50s in Europe. You might be an older worker on a totally different level in some southern countries. But then we are talking maybe about retirement age. It's a total different range. So an age limit will not do the trick. So we do need to have a kind of a social constructual description in the end, what aging really means, and the interaction with the society. And what we also need is a kind of monitoring process in the end to make it meaningful. Otherwise, it's just nice words on paper, what you all said in the beginning. So we need to find a very useful monitoring body, hopefully on national level too, because those on the national level are those who really know exactly what is happening. If you only have this international monitoring mechanism, this will bring member states to monitor their own national situation every 5 to 6 years, which is not good enough. So we also should try to get some kind of national monitoring and link it with the convention. There are already examples from the Council of Europe in regard of violence against women. and trafficking, for example. So there are different concepts. I think we do have a lot of models where we can pick and choose, but I think the Inter-American Convention and the Council of Europe recommendations gives you the best idea how an outline can look like.
And there is a secretariat established now, or there will be?
There is a
Okay.
secretariat established now with one person, but they are recruiting 2 more. So we will see.
Okay. Well, I think on that note, I will close this session.
Thank you.
Claudia, it's been a really inspiring talk. You've given us some practical suggestions, but I think also some inspiration and some encouragement not to give up. And so I'm saying to all of you, do take up that challenge.